The moment began with a quiet that felt heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that presses against your chest without warning. In a grand house, adorned with polished marble floors, expensive rugs, and the faint scent of fresh flowers, a black maid had found herself in a position she never imagined she would be in. She was sprawled across the floor, the hardness of the surface biting into her back, her body aching in ways that only exhaustion can carve into muscle and bone. Around her, the house hummed with the usual signs of wealth and routine, the soft tick of an ornate grandfather clock, the faint buzz of lights from high ceilings, the distant murmur of a television somewhere in a room she could not see. But none of that mattered in that moment because her world had shrunk to the space where she lay, cradling a baby in her arms. The child's head rested gently against her chest, its tiny hands curled around her fingers as though seeking comfort, warmth, and a sense of safety. She had been on her feet for hours, attending to the household's endless demands, cleaning surfaces that gleamed like mirrors, washing dishes that reflected the ceiling lights, making sure every corner of the house maintained an air of perfection. Yet the baby, who was not her own, had somehow found her, had somehow chosen her embrace, and she had succumbed to a fatigue that made the idea of standing or walking or even thinking a luxury she could not afford. The floor beneath her was cold, and though she had attempted to make a small nest with a folded blanket, it was insufficient against the weight of her exhaustion and the chill of the marble. She had been awake since before dawn, her own life outside these walls filled with responsibilities, chores, errands, and the quiet loneliness that often accompanies those who work in service to others' comfort while their own needs are sidelined. The child had been fussy earlier, restless and crying, demanding attention that required patience she had stretched to its limits. Now, in the dim light of the living room, the baby had finally settled, and she had allowed herself to lie down, not out of negligence but out of sheer, unrelenting fatigue. Her eyes were heavy, her muscles stiff, but she felt a strange, tender connection to the child whose small body pressed against hers. The warmth of the baby was a fleeting comfort against the harshness of the floor, a soft pulse of life that reminded her why she persisted despite the long hours and the often invisible labor that defined her days. She could hear the faint sound of her own breathing, shallow and uneven, mingling with the soft coos and sighs of the baby. In her mind, fragments of the day's work replayed in a hazy loop, folding endless stacks of laundry, washing dishes that never seemed to end, wiping fingerprints off polished glass, sweeping floors, dusting furniture, arranging flowers in vases that would only be admired briefly before being replaced. All the while, she carried a quiet sense of responsibility, a sense that if she faltered even for a moment, something essential would be neglected, disrupted, or left undone. And yet, in this small space on the floor, she had surrendered, if only momentarily, to the human need for rest. The room around her seemed almost surreal in contrast to her position. The polished surfaces gleamed under the chandelier's light, expensive paintings adorned the walls, and every piece of furniture was immaculate and carefully placed, designed for comfort, beauty, and status. She was fully aware of the irony, fully conscious of how her body pressed against the floor while the rest of the house seemed designed for ease and luxury. Her hands remained lightly clasped around the baby, her fingers tracing the tiny curves of its arms and legs, feeling the soft skin that contrasted so sharply with the cold hardness beneath her. She listened to the small sounds the baby made, the gentle rise and fall of its chest, the almost imperceptible movements of its tiny feet, the faint murmur of a sigh escaping its lips. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the room, every touch intensified by the surrounding stillness. She reflected on the fragility of the child, the immense trust placed in her, the invisible thread that connected them for these few fleeting minutes. There was a vulnerability in the act, a recognition of her own limitations, and yet a fierce determination to provide care despite her exhaustion. The weight of the baby on her chest was both comforting and heavy, a literal burden that mirrored the invisible weight of her responsibilities. She could feel the ache in her back, the soreness in her legs, the throbbing in her arms, and still, there was a tender attentiveness in the way she held the child, a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. In these moments, time seemed suspended, as if the world outside the walls of this house had disappeared entirely. The distant sounds of the city, the people walking by, the traffic, the chatter, and the noise of everyday life faded into nothingness, leaving only the small cocoon of warmth and trust between her and the baby. She was acutely aware of the precariousness of her position, the delicate balance between care and fatigue, responsibility and surrender, and yet she had chosen to remain present, fully immersed in the act of holding and comforting this tiny human being. Every thought, every heartbeat, every movement was directed toward maintaining that sense of safety, that fragile peace that had finally settled over the child. It was an intimate, unspoken connection that defied words, a moment that felt suspended in the intersection of exhaustion, care, and the quiet dignity of doing one's best under circumstances that offered no recognition, no applause, no acknowledgement beyond the gentle rhythm of the baby's breathing. The contrast between her position on the floor and the opulence surrounding her was stark and undeniable, highlighting not only the social divide but the quiet strength required to exist in such a space with grace and devotion. She felt the weight of the baby not as a burden to be complained about, but as a responsibility to be honored, a task that required the full measure of her patience, her care, and her humanity. Each small movement, each adjustment to keep the baby comfortable, required conscious effort, awareness, and care. Even as her eyes grew heavier and the room's silence wrapped around her like a soft blanket, she remained alert to every shift, every sigh, every tiny sound the child made. She knew the fragility of the moment, the impermanence of this peace, and the fleeting nature of rest in a life that demanded constant attention. The cold of the floor, the hardness beneath her, the ache in her body, all of it was present, undeniable, but it did not diminish her focus or the tenderness she felt. She was fully there, in the moment, in the reality of her exhaustion, and in the quiet intimacy of caring for another life so completely dependent on her for comfort and security. The room itself seemed to take on a different quality, the usual grandeur fading into a backdrop for this profoundly human scene, a woman, weary beyond measure, cradling a child, creating warmth and safety in a space that otherwise offered none. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the family she served, to the expectations that would follow her exhaustion, to the work that awaited once she finally rose, and yet, in this suspended moment, none of that mattered. Only the soft weight in her arms, the gentle rise and fall of the baby's chest, and the quiet rhythm of shared breathing defined the present. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, honesty, and quiet courage. Every fiber of her being was engaged in the act of nurturing, protecting, and sustaining, a testament to endurance and care that often went unseen but was no less vital for its invisibility. The ache in her muscles, the chill of the floor, and the weariness in her bones were all present, yet they were secondary to the sense of connection, responsibility, and tender vigilance that defined these few minutes. In the glow of the soft light, the contrast between the human fragility she embodied and the imposing grandeur of the house became even more pronounced, highlighting not only the sacrifices inherent in her role but the quiet strength, empathy, and resilience required to inhabit such a space while maintaining dignity and care. The weight of the baby on her chest was both literal and symbolic, a small yet profound reminder of the power of compassion, endurance, and the quiet acts of love that often go unnoticed in the spaces between expectation and recognition. At that exact moment, the sound of the front door opening broke the fragile silence of the room. The faint click of the lock, the subtle shift of the polished marble under well-heeled shoes, announced the arrival of someone whose presence immediately altered the energy in the house. The billionaire entered quietly at first, as if testing the air, stepping lightly yet with a confidence that only comes from years of authority and command over one's surroundings. He had been away on business, traveling through cities and airports, negotiating deals, making decisions that could shift markets and affect thousands of lives, yet in that instant, all of that significance seemed distant and inconsequential. He paused as he took in the scene before him. The house was immaculate, every detail meticulously maintained, every surface gleaming under the chandelier's light. But it was not the grandeur or the wealth that captured his attention, it was the image that unfolded in the center of the room, small yet striking, impossible to ignore. On the cold marble floor lay the black maid, curled protectively around the baby, her body curved like a shield, her head bowed, her arms locked around the child with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words ever could. The billionaire's gaze lingered, and in that moment, the layers of privilege, power, and status that usually defined him seemed to fall away. He saw not a housekeeper, not a servant, but a human being giving everything she had in a moment of vulnerability, a private, unobserved act of care that demanded recognition. He could feel the contrast between his life and hers, the vast chasm of resources, comfort, and security that separated them, and yet in that instant, all of that disparity seemed irrelevant. What mattered was the purity of the connection, the undeniable presence of responsibility, empathy, and love that transcended social hierarchies. He had always prided himself on efficiency, control, and the ability to manage every aspect of his world, yet here, in the quiet living room, he was confronted with a reality he could neither manage nor predict. The sight of her, exhausted yet unwavering in her care, struck him in a way that business reports, boardroom negotiations, and financial statements never had. He took a careful step forward, the sound of his shoes muffled against the marble, and his eyes never left the scene. There was a tension in the room, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable, the kind that arises when an observer becomes acutely aware of the intimacy unfolding before them. He knew he should not intrude, that etiquette and societal expectations dictated a measured response, yet some part of him recognized that witnessing this moment required more than polite distance. Every instinct screamed to act, to acknowledge, to respond in a way that would honor the quiet heroism of the woman on the floor. And yet, he hesitated, caught between respect, shock, and a sudden awareness of how rarely moments like this are seen or appreciated. The baby stirred slightly, sensing the shift in energy, and the maid adjusted her hold instinctively, her body still tense from exhaustion yet attuned to the subtle vibrations in the room. She did not look up, she did not make a sound. Her focus was absolute, entirely on the child, entirely on ensuring that in this cold, hard space, the baby felt nothing but warmth and security. The billionaire's heart quickened, a strange combination of admiration, guilt, and awe coursing through him. He had built an empire, acquired wealth beyond imagination, and moved through the world with a calculated efficiency that often left little room for genuine human interaction, and yet here, in a single glance, he was confronted with the raw, unfiltered humanity that existed in someone else's perseverance. He saw the marks of exhaustion etched on her face, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her body molded around the child as if every ounce of strength she possessed had been summoned to protect this tiny life. There was a humility in her posture, a quiet dignity that seemed almost impossible in such circumstances, and it forced him to reconsider the assumptions he had carried about the roles people play, the lives they lead, and the unseen sacrifices made every day. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, heavier than any boardroom negotiation or corporate decision he had ever faced. His mind raced through scenarios, considerations, and impulses. What should he do? What could he do? How could he respond in a way that acknowledged both her humanity and the vulnerability of the child she protected? He felt an unfamiliar tension, a mixture of awe and responsibility that was both disarming and compelling. As he took another cautious step forward, he noticed the subtle details that made the moment even more poignant. The tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her uniform, the faint rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the slight tremor in her arms from the effort of holding the baby so long without rest. Each detail reinforced the gravity of the scene, reminding him that this was not a staged moment, not a dramatization or an anecdote to be casually observed, but a real, lived experience that demanded awareness, empathy, and careful consideration. The grandeur of the house faded further into the background, replaced by the immediate, palpable reality of human care and connection. In that instant, he felt a shift inside himself, a recognition that true wealth, influence, and power were not measured solely in assets or accomplishments, but in the ability to perceive, acknowledge, and respond to acts of courage and compassion that often go unnoticed. He lingered there, suspended between observation and action, his mind attuned to the delicate balance of vulnerability, duty, and empathy that defined the moment. The contrast between his usual world of control, strategy, and authority and this intimate scene of exhaustion and care struck him profoundly, challenging assumptions he had never questioned before and stirring emotions he had long neglected. Every second stretched, each one filled with the silent weight of recognition, the quiet tension of an unspoken understanding between observer and the observed. He felt an urge to step closer, to speak, to offer comfort or assistance, yet something restrained him, a sense that intrusion might disrupt the delicate equilibrium, the fragile trust between the maid and the baby. Still, he could not tear his eyes away. The act of witnessing was itself transformative, compelling him to confront questions he had never asked about responsibility, privilege, and the simple, profound courage of someone giving their all without expectation of acknowledgement. The moment was heavy, layered with unspoken truths, each one reverberating through him, shaping his perception, challenging assumptions, and igniting a profound awareness of the human capacity for resilience and care. He could feel the tension in the room like a tangible presence, a force that demanded his attention, commanded reflection, and stirred empathy he had long kept at bay. Every micro-expression, every subtle movement, every quiet sound contributed to the weight of the moment, reinforcing the undeniable reality of what he was witnessing and the deep impression it would leave on him long after he left the room. The air seemed charged, the silence almost vibrating with the gravity of observation, a stark reminder that even in spaces dominated by wealth and opulence, moments of raw humanity carry a force that no luxury can replicate. He continued to watch, caught between admiration, disbelief, and a rising sense of moral imperative, fully aware that this instant, though brief, was unlike anything he had experienced in his meticulously ordered life. The raw human emotion in that room was palpable, almost suffocating in its intensity, yet quiet and subtle in the way it unfolded. It was the kind of emotion that does not need words, that cannot be fabricated or performed, and that emerges only when people are stripped down to their most vulnerable selves. The maid, exhausted, curled on the floor with the baby pressed against her chest, embodied a vulnerability so profound that it transcended social boundaries and expectations. Every breath she took, shallow and deliberate, carried with it a mixture of fatigue, care, and devotion that was impossible to ignore. Her arms held the baby with a tenderness that spoke of love, responsibility, and instinct, a natural empathy that required no recognition or reward. The child, in turn, responded in kind, the small rise and fall of its chest mirroring her own, the tiny fingers curling around her clothing as if seeking reassurance, warmth, and the comforting presence of someone willing to bear the weight of its fragility. In that room, the complexities of class, wealth, and privilege were temporarily suspended, replaced by the universality of human connection. The billionaire, standing silently a few feet away, became an unwitting witness to this unfiltered exchange of care and vulnerability. He could see the strain etched into the maid's face, the subtle tension in her shoulders, and the quiet determination in her posture, all signs of a person pushing past limits, performing labor not for accolades but for necessity and compassion. It struck him that emotion could carry a power no fortune could replicate, a resonance no contract could command, and a significance no achievement could rival. The scene forced him to confront feelings he had long buried beneath layers of ambition, strategy, and control, the recognition of suffering, the call of empathy, and the quiet admiration for resilience that exists in forms too often unseen. The room seemed to hold its breath along with him, the air heavy with the weight of human experience, the subtle cadence of lives intersecting in a moment both fleeting and profound. He noticed the way her eyelids fluttered as exhaustion pressed down, yet how she refused to let it compromise her care. Every small gesture, every micro-adjustment of the baby's position, carried meaning, a reassurance, a promise of safety, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fragility of life and the responsibility of those who watch over it. The emotion was layered, complex, and raw. It was fatigue intertwined with tenderness, desperation interlaced with devotion, and vulnerability framed by strength. It was a living paradox, a human truth that defied simple categorization. Even the silence spoke volumes, the quiet breathing of the baby, the muted shifts of the maid on the floor, and the subtle intake of breath from the billionaire as he absorbed the magnitude of the moment. Each sound amplified the gravity of what was unfolding, making the room feel both intimate and immense, personal yet universally relatable. The billionaire could not ignore the pull of that emotion, a magnetic force that demanded not only attention but reflection. He realized that the impact of wealth, status, or power could pale in comparison to the effect of witnessing authentic human care. It was not the act of cradling the baby itself that held power but the raw emotion entwined with it, the exhaustion, the commitment, the unspoken acknowledgement of responsibility, and the quiet heroism that required no fanfare. He felt the stirring of an internal reckoning, a confrontation with the limitations of his own understanding of human experience. The maid's dedication was a mirror, reflecting the simplicity and complexity of empathy simultaneously, and the billionaire found himself compelled to consider the emotional labor he had rarely acknowledged in his life or the lives of those around him. He observed the subtle expressions on her face, the gentle furrow of her brow, the slight downturn of her lips, the softness in her eyes that hinted at both weariness and resolve. Each detail conveyed volumes about what it meant to care for another being, especially when doing so required immense personal sacrifice. The room, the marble floors, the chandeliers, and the expensive furnishings faded into irrelevance in the face of this intimate, unvarnished display of human feeling. The emotional gravity of the moment was further amplified by the contrast between her position on the floor and the luxurious surroundings, a juxtaposition that highlighted not only the intensity of her care but the often invisible labor that underpins lives like hers. The billionaire could feel an almost physical pull in his chest, a combination of awe, guilt, and empathy, as he absorbed the weight of the scene. He recognized the courage it took to be present, to offer love and protection in the absence of comfort or recognition, and he felt a deep, stirring respect for the sheer humanity on display. There was no script, no rehearsed gesture, no superficial performance. Everything in the room, from the quiet sway of the maid's body to the tender coos of the baby, was organic, unplanned, and genuine. It was a lesson in the depth of human connection, one that transcended social status, wealth, and position, exposing the raw, essential truth that compassion and care are universal forces capable of bridging divides and touching hearts in ways material wealth never could. In that charged silence, the billionaire became acutely aware of how rare it is to witness such emotion unfiltered, unmediated, and profoundly real. He understood that emotion, in its purest form, carries both vulnerability and strength, a duality that is as powerful as it is humbling. The maid's quiet perseverance, the baby's reliance, and the unspoken connection between them created a resonance that seemed to fill the space, echoing in the corners of the room and in the depths of his awareness. It reminded him that human emotion is not only observed but felt, a contagion of empathy that spreads without intention, teaching lessons about care, devotion, and the unseen acts that define lives. Each heartbeat, each sigh, each subtle shift of posture contributed to a tapestry of feeling that demanded recognition, introspection, and a reckoning with the realities of privilege, duty, and shared humanity. The decisions made in the heat of empathy were not immediate, nor were they simple. The billionaire stood frozen, torn between the instincts of his wealth and authority and a sudden, undeniable recognition of the humanity before him. Every rational thought he had rehearsed in boardrooms, every calculated decision about investments, mergers, and acquisitions, seemed irrelevant in the presence of something so raw and essential. He realized that no amount of money, influence, or power could replace the intuition, care, and presence the maid demonstrated as she lay on the floor holding the baby. He considered the options available to him, each one weighted with consequence yet overshadowed by a new, unfamiliar priority, compassion. Should he speak? Should he approach? Should he intervene, or would that break the fragile equilibrium the maid had established, the delicate trust between her and the infant? His mind raced, cataloging the potential outcomes while his emotions pulled him in a different direction, a tug-of-war between his practiced authority and a nascent recognition of responsibility beyond wealth. He noticed the subtle signs of exhaustion that painted the maid's features, the tiny adjustments she made to ensure the baby's comfort, and he felt an impulse to act, to do something that acknowledged her efforts, even if it disrupted the decorum he was accustomed to maintaining. Every fiber of his being was drawn to the scene, compelled by empathy to make a decision, yet cautious about overstepping in a moment so intimate. He realized that any action had consequences not only for the immediate situation but for the dynamic between them, for the household, and for the broader understanding of care, dignity, and acknowledgement. In that instant, the weight of decision-making shifted from numbers, contracts, and profit margins to the pressing, tangible needs of a human being providing care under immense strain. His reasoning was a mix of instinct and reflection. Instinct demanded intervention, a gesture that would ease the immediate strain, while reflection forced him to consider the dignity and agency of the maid, to honor the quiet strength she demonstrated without turning it into spectacle. He thought about how often those who serve are overlooked, how frequently their labor, emotional and physical, goes unrecognized, and how rare it was to witness a moment where that labor revealed itself fully, without pretense or suppression. The urge to intervene was amplified by the sight of the baby, so small, so utterly dependent, the fragility of its life mirrored in the intensity of her effort. He understood that his decision would reverberate, shaping perceptions, altering relationships, and leaving an imprint on both of them. It was a choice that required balancing respect, morality, and the impulse to alleviate suffering. He considered offering comfort, perhaps a chair, a blanket, or assistance in holding the child, yet he hesitated, aware that even the most well-intentioned gestures could be interpreted as condescension or intrusion. He reflected on the subtle complexities of power and empathy, how those with authority often struggle to navigate moments of vulnerability without unintentionally asserting dominance, how recognition without understanding can feel hollow, and how true empathy requires patience, observation, and humility. He felt the tension building within him, a combination of admiration, urgency, and the desire to do what was right without disrupting the delicate balance of the present. Each decision point seemed fraught with risk. To act too quickly might appear patronizing, to hesitate too long might signal indifference. He was caught in the rare intersection of moral responsibility and human observation, a space where instinct, reflection, and emotion collided. His mind wandered to his own life, to the countless moments he had dismissed, overlooked, or taken for granted, and he felt a sudden clarity. Decisions grounded in empathy require a surrender of ego, a willingness to place the needs and experiences of others above one's own expectations or preconceptions. He understood, in a way he had rarely experienced, that the gravity of this moment was not simply about comfort or assistance but about acknowledgement, recognition, and the affirmation of another person's humanity. Each subtle movement the maid made, each careful adjustment, each soft sigh of the baby, reinforced the urgency of his decision, pressing him to navigate the tension between observation and action with sensitivity and care. The choices were multifaceted. He could remain a silent witness, allowing the maid to maintain her autonomy and dignity. He could offer help directly, acknowledging her effort while carefully avoiding any implication of judgment, or he could take broader action later, ensuring her labor and care were recognized in ways that extended beyond this single encounter. The complexity of these decisions weighed on him, not as abstract ethical dilemmas but as immediate, tangible responsibilities that demanded attention in real time. He felt a rare combination of humility and urgency, the recognition that despite all his worldly power, he was confronted by a situation that could only be navigated through empathy, observation, and the courage to act in a way that honored the humanity of those involved. In this tension, he realized that decisions made in moments like these define not only immediate outcomes but character, integrity, and the capacity to translate compassion into meaningful action. He felt the presence of responsibility in a visceral way, a heavy, insistent weight that could not be ignored or rationalized away. Every microdecision mattered: where to step, whether to speak, how to move, what gestures to make, and how to ensure that any intervention supported rather than diminished the trust that had been quietly established between the maid and the baby. He understood that inaction could be as consequential as action, that the timing, tone, and method of engagement would ripple outward, shaping perceptions, experiences, and emotional landscapes in ways that might endure far beyond the room. The process of deciding became almost meditative, a heightened awareness of the stakes, the human elements, and the subtle interplay of emotion and responsibility. He felt acutely the power of empathy to demand immediate attention, to compel action, and to reshape priorities in the most profound ways. The decision-making process was simultaneously exhilarating and humbling, an awakening to the profound impact that a single, attentive response could have in a moment defined by vulnerability, care, and raw human emotion. He knew that whatever path he chose would carry moral, emotional, and relational consequences, shaping not only this encounter but potentially his understanding of himself, his role, and the nature of responsibility itself. The immediate and long-term consequences of that moment unfolded like ripples across a still pond, each one touching lives and perceptions in ways that were not immediately visible but became increasingly undeniable with every passing second. In the immediate sense, the atmosphere in the room shifted the instant the billionaire made a choice to act, whether through the smallest gesture or a subtle acknowledgement. The maid, already exhausted from hours of labor, felt a mixture of surprise, relief, and cautious curiosity as she sensed attention directed toward her not in reprimand, but in recognition. The baby, still nestled in her arms, remained unaware of the human complexities unfolding around it, yet even the slightest relaxation of the maid's tension sent waves of calm through the child, a subconscious understanding that the presence of another observer did not threaten but, in some way, validated the effort she had put forth. In that instant, the balance of power, status, and expectation shifted, if only subtly. The billionaire's presence, once a distant authority figure in the hierarchy of the household, became an active participant in the emotional exchange, and the consequences of his attention were immediate: a recognition of labor often invisible, a validation of dedication, and a quiet acknowledgement that acts of care do not go unnoticed, even if they are rarely rewarded. Beyond the immediate effects, the long-term consequences began to take shape in the subconscious impressions left on everyone involved. The maid, in particular, was affected by the awareness that someone with immense power and social standing had witnessed her exhaustion, her care, and her unwavering dedication. There was a subtle shift in her sense of self-worth, a reinforced awareness that the labor she performed, though often unacknowledged in the broader world, held significance in ways that transcended immediate financial compensation or recognition. She felt a quiet affirmation that her empathy, resilience, and dedication had tangible value, even to those whose lives existed in vastly different realities. The billionaire, for his part, experienced a profound internal shift as well. The encounter forced him to confront the consequences of his privilege, not as a theoretical concept but as an immediate, lived reality. He became acutely aware of the ways in which wealth and status can create blind spots, moments of unawareness of the struggles and emotional labor of others, and the potential for influence to alter outcomes in profound ways. The simple act of noticing, engaging, and responding carried consequences that extended far beyond the walls of that room. He began to reflect on patterns in his own life, the decisions made in pursuit of success that may have overlooked or undervalued the contributions of those around him, and the ways in which a single, empathetic response could recalibrate relationships and perceptions. The interaction also had consequences that rippled outward into the broader household. The staff, witnessing even indirectly the billionaire's acknowledgement of the maid's care, could sense a subtle shift in the hierarchy of recognition, an awareness that dedication, empathy, and attentiveness might now receive acknowledgement rather than dismissal. The baby, too, would carry a sense of safety and connection formed in those early moments, a subtle but enduring consequence of being held and protected with unwavering focus and attention. Over time, the encounter would serve as a quiet reference point for all involved, a benchmark for human interaction that emphasized care over hierarchy, empathy over protocol, and recognition over disregard. Decisions made in that moment, however small they seemed in practical terms, had cascading effects that reshaped relationships, attitudes, and understandings. For the billionaire, the experience had consequences for his approach to authority, decision-making, and the moral weight of observation. He recognized that witnessing acts of care carries responsibility, that the power of presence is magnified by empathy, and that responding thoughtfully to human vulnerability is an action with both immediate and lasting impact. For the maid, the consequences were both emotional and practical. Emotionally, she carried forward the validation that her efforts mattered, the acknowledgement that her humanity and dedication were seen, and the subtle empowerment that comes from knowing that care, even when performed under extreme fatigue, resonates beyond the immediate act. Practically, the interaction could influence her relationship with the household, her role within it, and even the terms of how her labor and dedication were regarded in future interactions, providing opportunities for recognition, support, or tangible assistance she may not have previously expected. The consequences were also psychological, shaping perceptions of trust, authority, and human connection. The billionaire, having confronted the intensity of human vulnerability and devotion, began to internalize lessons about humility, responsibility, and the moral dimensions of influence. The maid, having been observed and validated, experienced an increased sense of agency, a subtle shift in confidence, and a reaffirmation of her capacity to affect others through her care and dedication. Even the physical space of the room seemed to carry the consequences forward, as if the marble floors, the soft light, and the objects surrounding them absorbed the gravity of what had transpired, creating an environment that retained the memory of that intimate, transformative interaction. Each gesture, each movement, each micro-expression contributed to the web of immediate and long-term consequences, a reminder that human interactions, especially those steeped in empathy, have resonance far beyond their initial appearance. The subtle acknowledgement, the careful attention, and the decisions made in that brief window created a framework for understanding the enduring power of compassion and observation. Over time, the effects would ripple further, shaping behavior, inspiring reflection, and encouraging acts of empathy in ways that might never be consciously recognized but were no less real or profound. Every element of the encounter, the maid's exhaustion, the baby's dependence, the billionaire's attention, combined to produce consequences that were intricate, layered, and lasting, a complex interplay of immediate action and long-term human impact, a testament to the quiet yet profound power of recognizing, responding to, and honoring the humanity of others. The lessons about compassion, privilege, and humanity began to crystallize in the quiet aftermath of that encounter, revealing themselves not through lectures or grand proclamations but through the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in awareness that occur when one truly witnesses the vulnerability and strength of another human being. In that room, the billionaire was confronted with the stark reality of privilege, not the abstract, theoretical concept often discussed in distant conversations or academic texts, but the lived, immediate awareness of how power, wealth, and social position can shield individuals from the raw struggles faced by those who serve, care, and labor tirelessly behind the scenes. He saw how privilege had insulated him from the fatigue, the physical pain, and the emotional labor that the maid had carried for hours, and he realized that recognition alone, even if small, could begin to bridge a gap he had long taken for granted. Compassion, he understood in that instant, was not merely a feeling but an action, a choice to see beyond one's own sphere of influence, to notice suffering and vulnerability, and to respond in a way that affirms the dignity of another. It was in the simplicity of holding space, of pausing, of observing without judgment, that he began to grasp the transformative power of empathy. The maid, exhausted yet unwavering in her care, embodied lessons that could not be taught in boardrooms or classrooms. Her dedication was not performative, it was a quiet, relentless commitment to the well-being of someone utterly dependent, carried out without expectation of reward or recognition. From her example, the billionaire learned that humanity is often expressed in acts too small to make headlines but too significant to be ignored. The lesson was multifaceted. It was about seeing, about feeling, about acting responsibly, and about acknowledging that the human experience is shaped as much by care, empathy, and moral attentiveness as by wealth, power, or influence. He reflected on the ways in which society often undervalues emotional labor, particularly when performed by those in marginalized positions, and he recognized that privilege carries with it not only opportunity but responsibility, the responsibility to observe, to respond, and to ensure that the humanity of others is honored. There was also a lesson in humility embedded in the moment, a recognition that no amount of accumulation or status could replace the authenticity of compassion and the tangible impact of attentive care. Witnessing the maid's quiet courage forced him to confront the limitations of his worldview, the blind spots created by privilege, and the ways in which true understanding requires engagement, not assumption. He realized that acts of kindness, recognition, and support, even when small, carry weight beyond immediate perception, shaping relationships, attitudes, and the moral compass of all involved. The baby, nestled safely in the maid's arms, became an unwitting teacher of innocence and dependency, a living reminder that the most fundamental human connections are forged through care and attentiveness rather than status or power. The scene illustrated how compassion is both immediate and far-reaching. It has the power to soothe, to validate, and to inspire reflection on the responsibilities we bear to one another. In recognizing her dedication, he also recognized a broader truth about privilege, that it is not merely an advantage to be wielded for personal gain but a tool that, when coupled with empathy, can amplify positive impact in ways that extend beyond material wealth. He understood that humanity is expressed not in transactions or accolades but in the deliberate, thoughtful attention we pay to the well-being of those around us, particularly those whose labor is often invisible yet foundational to the smooth operation of the world they inhabit. The encounter taught him to notice subtleties, the way exhaustion manifests in body language, the quiet resilience of someone committed to care, the unspoken bonds of trust that develop in moments of vulnerability. These lessons emphasized that compassion is as much about listening, observing, and validating as it is about intervening or offering support, and that the act of truly seeing another person carries profound moral weight. Privilege, he recognized, must be navigated with awareness. Without acknowledgement and thoughtful engagement, it can reinforce inequalities and blind us to the richness and complexity of human experience beyond our own immediate perception. The maid's steadfast dedication reminded him that courage, strength, and moral fortitude often exist in forms that go unnoticed, yet their impact resonates deeply, shaping lives in quiet, enduring ways. Humanity, in this context, was not abstract. It was tangible, demonstrated in how one treats the vulnerable, how one recognizes effort without entitlement, and how one balances power with responsibility. The lessons intertwined. Compassion required empathy, privilege required humility, and humanity required acknowledgement, action, and respect. He saw that these principles were not theoretical ideals but living, breathing realities, expressed in the choices we make, the attention we pay, and the recognition we offer. The scene underscored that true understanding emerges from experience, from presence, and from the willingness to confront truths about ourselves, the systems we inhabit, and the people whose lives intersect with ours in moments both ordinary and profound. Each gesture, each moment of care, each micro-expression of concern or comfort carried layers of significance, reinforcing the idea that empathy is active, privilege is accountable, and humanity is expressed in attention, respect, and deliberate moral engagement. He realized that these lessons, once internalized, have the power to shape behavior, influence decisions, and cultivate a deeper awareness of the interdependent nature of human life. The encounter became a catalyst for reflection, a living demonstration that understanding and responding to the needs of others is not simply an ethical choice but a defining aspect of personal character and social responsibility. The lessons were clear, resonant, and enduring. Compassion transforms, privilege obliges, and humanity demands recognition, empathy, and action in ways that reverberate far beyond the initial moment of awareness.